I'm in Kramatorsk. I'm here filming with a bunch of different aid groups and just seeing what the situation is around here as the Russians advance closer and closer to Konstantinivka. Yesterday we drove into Konstantinivka. Today we're planning to drive into Konstantinivka again. So I wanted to talk about what's going on in LA because I've been out here since the entirety of that has started kicking off, and I haven't really made any comment besides just a few things on social media because I've been distracted with filming body recovery and a bunch of other stuff out here. So the first thing I want to say is that, to me, before I get into any addendums I need to put on so people don't say I'm pro destruction of 7-Eleven, I believe that the Trump administration has escalated this basically at every point. Not only because of unprecedented action of taking control of the National Guard that hasn't been done since Lyndon B. Johnson did it in 1965, but also because of how the Trump administration talks about immigration, talks about people's due process and their ability to go through the courts and have their day through our judicial system, but just on the casual way at which he drops hand grenades when it comes to presidential policy. I could point to any of the specific instance of the President of the United States using demonizing language to talk about immigrants, always talking about them as a murderous horde of rapists and killers and gang members, and then the majority of the people that are getting scooped up are construction workers, or Stephen Miller is putting out policy that's telling agents to look outside of Home Depot. Then, by the way, I just want to throw out there, MS-13 members don't really hang out outside getting day jobs at Home Depot. MS-13 members are usually doing, drug deals and murdering, and I don't know of how many drug deals are really happening outside of the plywood section. So that, the demonization is already bad enough. But when you talk about certain policies that are not legal, for example, when the President of the United States doesn't only ignore court orders to deport Mr. Garcia from Maryland, who was doing aluminum sheet metal work at the time, and at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if Mr. Garcia was personally involved in 9/11. If he doesn't get his day in court and the judge says don't deport him, the reason why it's scary for any president to violate a court's order is because if you violate a court order in this instance, then maybe you will violate a court order in another instance when it has to do with the rights of me and you and not just somebody you don't know. But putting that aside, putting away the ignoring of the judicial system, which is extremely important for our three co-equal branches of government, there's also been a bunch of false deportations. And not only are we talking about deporting people with no criminal record to El Salvador, where it's even bad enough that the president, Bukele, who's basically a popular dictator in the country at this point, is asking our administration, please give us evidence that the people you're sending us are criminals. Also, could you please stop sending women to the men's prison? That's not really where we keep the women. Also, are the women criminals? Look, that's bad enough. But when the President of the United States floats, seriously, not as a joke, I'm sick of everybody saying every single policy proposal from the President is ironic. Oh, don't worry, he's not going to pardon all of the J6ers. Law and order, law and order, law and order. Oh, wait, look, he pardoned every single one. That's J.D. Vance. He said he wasn't going to do that. But he said, seriously, while the cameras were rolling to Bukele, I want to deport the homegrowns, the homegrown criminals, meaning you or me violating a law on American soil is supposed to go through an American judicial system, and if we violated the law, then we go into an American prison. And the reason that we'd be put in American prison is because this is where our system is supposed to make sure that we still get certain rights, that we're protected, that we, are treated of some level of human dignity. Now, if you know anything about the American criminal justice system, that's not always going to be the case, but that's how it's supposed to work. And he floated the idea of taking those people and deporting them to foreign prisons. Foreign prisons. And look, one day it's going to be, hey, this guy is a horrible rapist, this guy is a horrible murderer. Maybe you won't care if that person gets deported, but it's the president that sets. While the President of the United States is talking about making it illegal to participate in certain types of speech, one day it'll be flag burning, the next day who knows what it'll be. that shows that, look, one day it could be this horrible guy, next day it could be you, next day it could be them. That's why at the end of the day, no matter how bad you are, no matter how much of a scumfuck you are, you're supposed to have certain judicial protections that protects every American. And so when the president is talking about deporting American citizens to foreign prisons, when they're ignoring the courts, when they're snatching up American citizens, when they're whether there be a pregnant woman on a construction site or whether it be just somebody walking down the street, there used to be a system for how these raids went where you would have lists of who you're going for. You're looking for this guy and this guy and this guy, where Stephen Miller's now telling them just look outside of Home Depot. It's not as simple as who threw the first rock or who started the original point of violence. When you're the president of the United States, you're supposed to be better than the guy who is looting Modelo's out of the local gas station. You're supposed to be the highest authority in the land. You're supposed to be someone of respect, somebody of prestige, somebody that the people can look to for not only, safety and protecting the nation, but also as an example. And if the message that these people are getting is, you could be an American citizen and you could get deported, then how are they supposed to believe that there is any system in place to protect them? Whether or not there is, if that's what the highest authority in the land, the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, is saying, and we now have soldiers participating in law enforcement operations in the state of California. Let me just say, directly removing them might not be where they're at, but if you're protecting the ICE agents as they participate in those operations, I don't really see the difference. If you're protecting ICE agents as they enforce immigration policy, you're participating in law enforcement operations. And if you want to say, well, they're not, it's a distinction without a difference. These behaviors from the Trump administration, I think, is what escalated this to this point. If Donald Trump had talked the way he talked on the campaign trail and then used every legal means at his disposal, followed what the court said, and engaged in a type of dialogue that you would expect from an immigration hawk, but not somebody who, say, has no regard for the law of the land, then maybe the situation wouldn't have spiraled to this point. Maybe it would have, maybe it wouldn't have. We can't, predict what the future would have been under different circumstances. We can predict all we want, but we can't know for sure. All I know is that since Donald Trump has gotten into the White House, he has escalated it at every single point, both rhetorically and in the actions he has taken. And so, yeah, I don't like somebody burning some random car that has nothing to do with immigration policy. I don't like somebody looting Modelo's and then throwing it at people. These are not things that I like. But these are things that have happened at many different points in American history once the government failed to keep the peace, or in any other number of instances where the situation has escalated to this point. Sometimes it was the government that escalated it. Sometimes it was different civic action groups or street groups or whatever. In this case, I think it was the President of the United States. And not only the way they have gone about immigration enforcement, where we have people in Los Angeles not going to their children's graduation ceremonies because they're afraid that they're going to get picked up on what is supposed to be the proudest day of their life. This is the first time a member of their family has graduated from high school, and they're afraid to go because they think that it is not beneath this administration to ruin that day for them. Not to even mention all the people who are leaving their court appearances, or the fact that the government is smashing its credibility because it said, look, if you participate in the DACA program and you give us this information, we won't use it against you. Now the Trump administration is trying to use it against you. I don't want to get onto a separate tangent on how Donald Trump doesn't see his time in office as a continuation of the United States, but just a continuation of his time in office. That's why he can disrespect treaties made by other administrations. That's why he can disrespect trade deals. That's why he can disrespect any agreement made by the last administration. Because he's Donald Trump, he's not the next administration. But that's a totally different topic. Anyway, I just wanted to get it across that at the end of the day, I think it is Trump that has escalated it to this point, both rhetorically and by the actions he has took, and it is up to the Trump administration to de-escalate it. Because even if the LA protests are eventually calmed down, if they continue to engage in this way, it won't be the LA protests, maybe it'll be the Baltimore protests, maybe it'll be, a different protest somewhere else, okay? Anything that has loss in it is probably going to be, a bad time for the Trump administration. So, he escalated it to this point. Now, I think I've made it very clear that I don't think the Trump administration is doing a bueno job. Okay, is bueno the right word to use? I failed my Spanish. I cheated through the entirety of my Spanish class.
Bueno is good.
Bueno is good. Now, when we talk about the protests, there is a crisis on the left when it comes to optics. This is not a new crisis. This is an impending crisis. It's like the water shortage or, climate change. This is something that kicks up its head anytime something like this comes around. Optics is not a dirty word. Every single successful activist organization in the past has thought about optics, thought about how they were perceived, and have tried to work to make it that the American people is sympathetic towards their cause. When John Lewis marched across that bridge and got beaten, that was done with optics in mind. That was done with the fact that they saw cameras there. That was done under the idea that we want to show the American public the brutal reality, the savage reality of what segregation is. So the most successful activists from our past, whether you go all the way back to Douglas, you go to John Lewis, you go to anyone, the most successful activists of our past thought about how the public perceives them, because once you have the public support, any action you want to take or push the government to do is going to be much easier. Now, I'm saying that with the knowledge that if you're on the ground and you're angry, maybe optics isn't your first concern. But if your first concern is actually impacting the American people, impacting legislative agenda, impacting the government to make them want to back off because they see the public turning against them, we should not be getting polling numbers like 59% of the American public thinks that Trump's deploy of the National Guard is a good idea, with only 30% being against it. I think it was 30 to 39%. Whatever number it is, it shows that Donald Trump, despite the type of rhetoric that their administration has used, despite the fact that we have DHS responding to the really heart-touching story of the menswear guy, his story as a Vietnamese refugee who was brought to the United States as a baby. They're joking about deporting him to a country he's never known. These are all optics failures on a monumental scale. When I talk to people, when I call Americans back home, and I'm talking like conservative Americans, some people even Trump voters, and I talk about like, hey, people shouldn't have to hide during their graduation ceremony. This is all stuff that I have yet to hear like, yeah, actually I think that's a good idea. So these are all potential, sorry, there's a lot going out outside, crematories. These are all potential points of victory that I feel are being lost because people want the aesthetics of subversion. You want to be able to say, look at me in front of the burning car, look at me terrified of our national flag, terrified of the American flag, look at me throwing Modelos at the police, look at me, I'm so fucking cool. You know what isn't cool? The fact that you're giving the Trump administration the very ammunition that they're going to use to deport your neighbors. I'm not saying this under the idea that you don't feel like you're resisting when you're scuffling with a cop. And I'm not even saying that you should never be able to defend yourself against police violence. What's that bastard's name? I'm sorry, Rick J. Linton, this son of a bitch. If you're shooting people recording you at point blank, right? These are the type of people that nobody's going to be angry if somebody like pushes them to the ground because they don't want to have some person get shot in the eye because this psychopath has been given a badge and a gun. When you see the one cop shoot that Australian reporter in the leg because she's doing her job, but I guess, screw the press, screw the journalists, we all have to make the media the enemy now. That type of behavior does deserve a certain response, but there also needs to be a question of what is the smart response, not just the response somebody deserves, or the response that you feel in your heart of hearts is going to give you passion. I don't care about feeling righteous indignation. I don't care about you being able to virtue signal and look at all your friends and say, yeah, I showed those pigs, ACAB, ACAB, ACAB. What I care about is making sure that this administration is kept in line, right? And whatever actions are necessary to do that need to be done. Abiding by the legal protections that we all have as Americans, abiding by the legal protections that every human being, regardless of their immigration status, gets in their due process, their day in court, getting everything that we are due. And if we're distracted with making ourselves look like people who don't particularly like the country, who don't particularly care about how the community looks by the end of this, it's not going to be swaying people to our sides. And so you'll have to ask yourself this question. Is your goal to feel good about yourself and to go out there and scuffle with the cops because you want to be able to be subversive? Or is your goal to build a movement that people don't feel embarrassed to associate with? That the people that the Trump administration are scared to lose could put their money behind, could put their physical support on the ground behind, right? If the image that people were getting were of a bunch of people marching across a bridge as the police behaved how they behaved in this instance too, with the shooting at that journalist, with the shooting at people with rubber bullets at point blank. And let me tell you something, they call it non-lethal. A rubber bullet can kill you. A lot of the equipment that have been used at riot suppression can kill you. We've just gotten very lucky that nobody has died yet, and I'm hoping that stays the case. But there could be something that happens that could change a lot of this nation's history. And so the question we need to ask ourselves as people who care about making sure that the presidency abides by the law, gives everybody the rights that they're due, and are not marching army units into our communities in order to enforce immigration law. If you want to convince the public to turn against the administration, when currently that's not what you've succeeded in doing, then we need to at least care about optics. I'm not saying become a slave to optics. Fight for things that are righteous. If something's righteous and you want to, fight for it and it's not popular, then try to make a convincing argument. Like, I don't believe that the American government should have the death penalty. That's something I stand against. But if I go out in public and I start beating off, and someone comes up to me and says, Dylan, what the fuck are you doing? Why are you beating off in public? I'm protesting against the death penalty. Okay, congratulations. You haven't succeeded in anything. Yeah, I've gotten attention. Ooh, I feel righteous. I feel good in other ways too. But you didn't succeed in anything. You go out in public, I burn the American flag. Congratulations, you feel better. You feel subversive. You didn't succeed at anything. You didn't succeed at anything. And so ultimately, the question has to be, are we a movement that wants success? Or are we a movement that wants to endlessly critique power, okay? Of course, I'm using movement broadly here, but in the broadest sense imaginable, making sure that the Trump administration abides by people's human dignity and abides by the constitutional rights that every human being within the continental United States has. And if that is our goal, then optics should not be treated like a dirty word, because as long as you treat optics like a dirty word, they will grab the American flag, they will wrap themselves in it, and they will point to the burning cars and saying, we're protecting you from that lawlessness. Mind you, it's not about, they don't care about the lawlessness. If people storm the Capitol, they're going to bail them out of prison, whether or not they're going to get in a shootout with the police after they bail them out. That happened. Look it up. And so, again, optics isn't a dirty word. The president is the person who escalated to this situation. Stealing Modelo's isn't going to protect anybody from being deported. I think that the constitutional rights of every person in the country needs to be protected, and we need a movement that's responsible enough to put that first before the virtue signal.